Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. It's 1 o'clock, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let's see, oh, okay. We're having some technical difficulties. Let me upload the presentation. Sorry about this. Okay, I will share my screen, I think. All right, let's try this. Okay, and now I'm going to show the presentation. Maybe. There we go. All right. Can everybody see the presentation now? Okay, good.
Yes, it's up.
Thank you. I can only see a couple people here. So again, welcome today. And please introduce yourselves in the chat. By now, I think we're getting to know each other, but it's still good to have that information there for folks who don't remember or haven't been around in a while. And we're going to try to use the chat again and and still keep the conversation going. It's a little bit difficult, but we'll do our best. And please turn on the camera when you speak. Okay, this is old news. We have 6 volunteers. We've had 2 meetings so far, and we're making tracks on getting the end user survey out, I think at the beginning of next week. And I included in the meeting materials that you can either get in box or on the website, this updated and probably more clear version of the meetings that are happening this summer. And so you can have that in front of you when you need it. And now I'm going to turn this over to Chris and take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to dive into what makes a risk assessment. And for the next little bit. So a risk assessment, a natural hazards risk assessment, integrates hazards, exposure to those hazards, vulnerability of the exposed assets or people to that hazard, and then the capacity or ability to mitigate or adapt to that event. So if you go to the next slide, we put together an illustration that helps explain the equation a little bit more, the risk assessment equation.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Yep, there you go.
All right, so the way we've characterized the risk assessment equation thus far is it's based loosely on the IPCC recent illustration. So the hazard is the natural hazard event described by their nature, frequency, extent, and probability. And as you know, we have 12 of those that we are evaluating within the risk assessment. And so we evaluate the potential or the probability of those hazards happening either qualitatively or quantitatively, depending on the information we have for each of those hazards. And then the next part is exposure. What is exposed to that hazard? And that exposure can be people, assets, ecosystems, crops, just any of the elements that we decide we want to assess exposure for. it's highly unlikely that we will get in this risk assessment into the ecosystem exposures, but keep that in your mind, because if there's a way to do that, we would like to include it. The next a question we ask ourselves is, what characteristics of those exposed people, assets, ecosystems make them susceptible to harm? So people could have vulnerabilities related to their lack of resources, or the fact that they are living in a home that is not hardened to the hazards, and so on. So that's vulnerability. And then the fourth pillar, which is kind of a new addition to the risk equation, introduced by the IPCC recently, is the capacity to respond to those hazards, and the not only the capacity, but the consequences of that response. So a response could be addressing could address a short-term time horizon or a long-term horizon. So all of these 4 elements make up the what we call the risk equation. And our intention in the natural hazard risk assessment is to articulate each of these pillars as best we can, quantitatively if we can, qualitatively if we can't, and then integrate it into a risk characterization. So does anyone have any questions so far or comments about this diagram? I can't see the chat, so.
I had a question. This is
Yes.
Paul with the Core.
Uh-huh.
So, and just to clarify what you're doing for what you're saying, that what you just talked about, you're doing across all hazards, and then within each hazards, I'd imagine that you're identifying specific events within the hazard. So I guess
Yes.
I'm wondering how thorough or how inclusive will you be? Like, obviously I'm thinking about flood. So like, how inclusive are you going to be with those events and that characterization?
By inclusive, do you mean, are we going to look at all 4 of the pillars for each of the hazards?
Yeah,
Each
like,
of the
well, I mean, I
bubbles?
guess I was sort of thinking of, are you going to say, obviously there's the 100-year, and like, so that could affect a large swath, or maybe there's a dam failure, and that would flood all of Eugene. And so I guess I'm wondering, where is that limit?
Yes, those are the decisions. That's exactly the kind of decision we're going to have to make for each one of the hazards.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
that's why I wrote down here, described by their nature, frequency, extent, and probability. So
okay, that's what you mean. Okay.
So we can have different scenarios within each of those hazards if we have a lot of resources, or we can choose one scenario. That's a decision that we will have to make. But yes, the hazards can come at different frequencies, extents, and probabilities, and we have to decide what we're going to evaluate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And also over what time horizon. Are we looking over 40 years, 100 years, 200 years, 400 years, whatever? Yeah, so this is actually a fraught, more fraught than it seems like, than it's really described right here. Any other questions about this diagram?
Hi, Chris. This is Jay Wilson.
Hi.
I'm just chiming in, echoing what Paul just said, primarily because of going through the hazard and vulnerability analysis for our current mitigation plan update. And then I just sat in on TriMet's kickoff meeting for their generating a mitigation plan for their district. And we went through an exercise like this with these sliding scales for hazards and vulnerability. And I guess the issue I run into is comparisons. I think each one individually in and of itself can have its own level of I don't know what to say, authenticity or integrity. But when you start comparing them or ranking them is where I think you end up having so much more subjectivity when it comes to impact, versus recurrence interval versus intensity versus vulnerability. And so I guess maybe I'm just going on the record for that more than anything, knowing that there's no clean and simple way to approach this when you're having to inventory these and find ways to prioritize or strategize and justify what you're doing.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Yes, each one of these bubbles is associated with some kind of uncertainty. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So yeah, this diagram looks simple, but in practice, it's hard to actually do well. All right. So we go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about each of these bubbles in a little more detail.
Whoops.
So as we just talked about, the hazard is the type, location, frequency, intensity, duration, hopefully described in terms of probability. But then in our next risk assessment, we're going to have to evaluate how those hazard characteristics are modified by climate change. So that just adds another layer of analysis and uncertainty to our layer. And do we do that by making a educated guess, or do we do it by some sort of model? Those are decisions that we still have yet to make. So I'm just giving a sort of broad overview. So, and also we have to think about whether, as Jay just mentioned, are we talking about acute hazards? Are we talking about chronic hazards? Acute being a flood that happens every 50 years or every 100 years, and chronic being something that happens gradually over time, like a sea level rise or a slow moving landslide or something like that. And then we have the other water hazard of high hazard potential dams, which is not exactly a natural hazard, but FEMA wants it included in the risk assessment. So that's another element of the flood hazard that we need to think about.
Chris, Emma has
Yes.
her hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Emma.
Hey, Chris. I don't know if this question is, well, I'll just ask it. I don't know if there, how do I ask this question? Are we addressing how different hazards are connected or correlated in some sense based on
Save that question for about 5 slides from now.
Okay.
Because that is something I want to talk about.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. Right now, I'm just kind of going through some broad definitions. All right, we can go on to the next slide. So then we're talking about exposure. So what is exposed? Who is exposed? Are we talking about buildings, or a subset of buildings, critical facilities? Are we talking about lifelines, roads, bridges, gas lines? What are we talking about? And those suite of assets that we are going to evaluate in the risk assessment are, again, not defined yet. And it's one of our tasks in the next few weeks is to figure out what we can realistically evaluate for exposure.
Next.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we get to vulnerability. So we have things and people that are exposed to a hazard or maybe multiple hazards, and they have characteristics that make them more or less vulnerable to harm. So that's vulnerability, is susceptibility to impacts or harm given the characteristics of those things. And so vulnerability will vary by the hazard type. And so we have to think about how we characterize vulnerability for each hazard. So that's the equation is getting bigger every time we go to a new bubble. We can go on the next one. And then there's the response. How do the responses that we choose reduce the risk of harm over time? Or do they do that by reducing exposure, reducing vulnerability? And there's a technique out there called mitigation pathways or adaptation pathways that seeks to, in kind of an event tree manner, to look at different ways of approaching reducing risk over time. And some of those methods may be reduce the risk for a short period of time. And sometimes that would allow a follow-on project to continue to reduce risk, or sometimes it's terminal, like the levee situation. You build the levee, it protects an area, but there isn't much you can do. You're not likely to build the levee higher. And then there's the green infrastructure type of projects that can change over time. And so the response question generally has not been included in a risk assessment, but I think we might want to consider at least providing a framework for folks to consider how their responses reduce risk over time, and whether they're terminal or if they have the opportunity to be expanded or continued. So that's why that is included. All right, any questions about the basic terminology? All right, we can go on to the next slide. All right, so adding to the complexity of the risk equation is the fact that probabilities can be assigned each element of the risk equation. And in addition, uncertainty can be assigned to each element of the risk equation. So as we multiply these parts together, the total probability of harm changes, and the risk bands will likely increase. So there comes a point where your uncertainties are greater than is acceptable, and we have to address that somehow. A lot of many natural hazard risk assessments do not address uncertainty very well. And in fact, the National Risk Index doesn't address it at all. So one of the decisions that we will need to make is whether and how, and I hope it's not whether, how we address uncertainty within our risk assessment. So this is an area where I would welcome your insights and expertise. This is one of the hard parts of the risk assessment. Questions here? Comments? Okay, moving right along. All right, so getting to Emma's question, we do have a choice to make also about how we approach multiple events. We're dealing with 12 hazards. Do we evaluate each one independently and treat them independently? Do we try to do a composite risk? Do we look at coupled events? For example, heavy rains lead to landslides. And do we look at cascading events? And those would be things that, because this happens, that happens, not so much coupled, but it's more along the lines of displacement causing economic effects, causing supply chain effects or whatever. So there are different ways to evaluate the multiple events, coupled events, cascading events. And we will need to decide how far we can go in evaluating those different types of enhancements, I guess, to risk. Any questions, insights there? Concerns? Okay, I'm not seeing any. I mean, I know you probably have a bazillion questions, but
Chris, I'll jump in for the sake
Yes.
of sport here.
Yes.
One thing that Gianna Alessi, who's on the call now, and she's our rare participant from the University of Oregon, we've worked on with our current plan update was we put together a table as kind of an experiment of looking at kind of a hazard index vertically and horizontally, and then where the nexus is between some of these, such as post flooding from wildfires, and trying to at least account for in our document for FEMA these relationships as a way of helping to explain, maybe why we're using a certain grant fund for a certain hazard, or the nature of how complex and interrelated or interdependent some of the hazards are. It's just the first time we put it together and trying to explain or justify how some of these connections are made, what the end game is on it. That's why your issue here about evaluating them as coupled events or cascading events just kind of piqued my curiosity. But it to me, I appreciate it is because it's not just the cascading of how one hazard triggers another hazard, but the downstream impacts to all of the infrastructure in the built environment, through these kind of spiraling, compounding hazard events as well. Anyway.
Yeah, compounding, that's a good word. I should have put on that slide. Thank you. I would really like to see that table and have you walk me through how you put it together. I think that could be really interesting.
Well, I don't know how defensible it is or what we're actually going to use it for, but it was kind of an idea that was thought of just how do we add a little bit more value or flavor to what we're doing.
Yeah, I can see it. Even if we can't use it quantitatively, just being able to explain how these are linked could be really helpful.
It's just a very this is kind of the first iteration of it, and we're looking at it like, is it a direct or indirect impact? So my goal would be for it to be expanded out, but right now it's just a bit of a diagram that we had a thought exercise on, so it definitely can be improved upon.
Yeah, that direct, indirect is another word I could have used on this slide. So I saw a question about not grasping the difference between probability and uncertainty. So think of it this way. Probability is the chance that something will happen, and you give that a value. There's a 50% chance that you're going to get heads or tails. The uncertainty is whether that is a fair coin. Is that coin going to result in that 50% probability because it's not, because it's weighted correctly? Does that analogy help?
If I could just speak in up, I'm the one that asked the question. My name's Chris. So I guess what I was wondering is the uncertainty in there because of the imperfection of our ability to analyze the likelihood of an event or the risk that is associated with that event? Is that where the uncertainty comes?
That's correct. It's
our your best, but and this is based on what you know. This is the probability, but you have to assume you don't know everything, or you don't know it as well as you'd like to. Is that it? Sort of.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Yep. And those uncertainties propagate through the equation. So I think it's important that we at least acknowledge that they exist, even if we might not be able to quantify them or propagate them through the analysis.
So Ken has a question.
Yes.
Hi, Ken Schlegel, Washington County here. I just wanted to comment on your question here about evaluating it independently or grouping them. Based on our experience, we just went through for the Washington County plan. We had the same kind of question and wrestled with the same questions. In our case, due to the rabbit holes that could go down and how long those rabbit holes can drag out. We decided to just for the purposes of the NHMP and then subsequent development of specific mitigations, we evaluated them independently, realizing that yes, a significant amount of rain can lead to a landslide, can lead to a flood. But those, like we've talked about, cascading events, and like I say, you can just go down a lot of rabbit holes doing that, and a lot of what ifs. But because of the timeline that we were on, we simply acknowledged that those would happen, and we were able to just kind of quickly surmise under a specific event that the causes may be, X, Y, and Z, but without really going into further detail. So just wanted to relay our experience in our case on and how we handle this situation.
Thank you. It's kind of along the same lines that Jay and Gianna were talking about, just building a table that acknowledges those connections. But then what do you do with it is a challenge.
Paul?
Okay, that was quick. So I was good, in the core, we evaluate uncertainty for the dams and for our planning processes. And we separate two types of uncertainty, both model uncertainty, our ability to estimate the results with degree of accuracies. And we also, the second part of that uncertainty is the natural environment uncertainty. So how well do we represent the characteristics of the natural environment in our models? For example, we might have a roughness factor that we put into a model, but the model itself has some accuracy with it, but then the roughness factor representing the roughness of the channel might have an error factor with it, and that is compounded with each parameter that we use to model the natural environment with. And so what we do is we have a range for each of those parameters, and we sample the results. So we ask the question, and then we sample it many times, and then the resulting bounds with which we come up with responses is the uncertainty. So we'd have a mean value, and then we have those bounds. That's very computationally intensive.
Yes.
But that's, I just wanted to, I don't know, I want to offer that in terms of that's the way that the core looks at uncertainty with our planning processes.
Thanks. And I think that's a technique that's used more and more widely. But it is computationally intensive.
Yeah.
Zach?
Oops, wrong camera. Hi. I guess I just wanted to extend this conversation about uncertainty because it does relate to, I think, a couple of meetings before we were talking about kind of the social constraints. And so I want to extend kind of into that other area of like how natural hazards are affecting certain communities historically, and getting at different societal, I guess, issues, like it kind of just is adding on to the pile of just like there's a lot of uncertainty. But I guess I would just want to speak up on the fact like it is worth kind of digging into those areas to put together like things that we're prioritizing that like gets at the whole spread on that diagram you just showed is would be a really worthwhile endeavor.
Thank you. Yes, can we go back to that diagram for a moment before I move on to the next thing?
This one?
There we go. Yeah. So yes, as I mentioned, probability and certainty can be associated with every one of these bubbles. And we can't go through we're unlikely to be able to go through a full uncertainty analysis for each one of these bubbles and then combine it all into multiple executions to, on the boundaries to figure out the whole risk uncertainty. So we do have some big decisions to make about how we characterize and combine probability and certainty, given the fact that we don't have a supercomputer in the basement.
Paul, do you have something else to say, or is that a leftover hand?
Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I'm having to go back and forth. I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we didn't miss something. Okay, so let's go back to where we were
Yep.
here.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit if we're done with this conversation, at least for now. This is really just an introduction of terminology and things to think about. So we can go on to the next slide. All right, so we can go on to the next one.
Oops.
There are different
Sorry.
ways to characterize the social part. And they're kind of grouped into two big approaches. One looks at characteristics of individuals as described by census. And I think we're one slide ahead of where I want to be. Oh, or I guess my slides are just mixed up. Okay, let's go back to the blue slide. That one, yeah. Okay, so yeah, the two different ways of looking at things are individual characteristics and then compiled together. And usually that information comes from census. And then there's another way to look at it where we look at the characteristics of how the community works together to how bonded they are with each other, how engaged they are with each other. So those are two different approaches, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are different. So we can go on to the next slide. And the reason why this is important is because it helps us understand the area of interest, the community's ability to cope or adapt to changes. So it's the real question is, how do we measure coping or adaptive capacity? So in these two broad, we can go to the next slide, ways of looking at things. There's the social capital approach, which looks at how connected people are to their families and how insular they are within those family groups or close friend groups. And then there's bridging, which is how much those family or friend groups interact with other family and friend groups. And then in the social capital rubric, there's linking. How do those connected family and friend groups interact with the bigger outside world? And I would say this diagram actually needs another line where we want to know also how the family and friend bonding groups interact with the outside world, government and NGOs and so on. Big NGOs, national NGOs. So there is a person or a group of people who have been noodling on this problem for a while and have developed what they call the Social Capital Index. And it looks at 19 different indicators from publicly available data to assess the strength of bonding, the strength of bridging, and the strength of linking social capitals. And so that's one way of looking at the dynamics of a community and its how it might be vulnerable to hazards, how well it can cope with hazard events, and what interventions we might make to either strengthen any one of those connections. And then the other approach, which is really commonly used, this is the social vulnerability index approach, where individual characteristics of individuals are consolidated into I guess different categories that describe how able a person is to respond or what their vulnerability to a hazard might be. So this is a different approach in that it doesn't really talk about how people interact with each other, but it does highlight characteristics that indicate that a person is likely or not to be able to, or a group of people is likely or not to be able to respond to a hazard. So this is the social vulnerability index approach. So I'm curious if people have any experience with using these two different approaches, any insight, concerns, questions? Nothing?
Hi,
Okay.
Chris.
Mhm.
Well, one thing that I came back from the Natural Hazards Center workshop recently, and it applies directly to this, is FEMA's got this new community resilience zone project that they're doing, and but it's national and it's all with census tract. And so one of the things for them, I think it was to try and help communities have a kind of a more standardized approach for applying for grant assistance. But I felt like if it's census tract data, then obviously you've got higher resolution in the urban areas and less resolution and less confidence in the data in the more rural areas with these really large census tracts. And so I guess my issue is this is always going to be the problem or the conundrum is the quality of how you're measuring or comparing these indices when it's definitely biased towards, urban areas that are much more easily captured than the rural areas with the larger tracts and lower population bases and the underrepresented populations that don't even take the census or participate. And so I guess, how do you account for that? Or how can we find a way to leverage, or, I mean, this is maybe more philosophical question, but I ask them very point blank is, can you provide technical assistance to have more capacity building in the rural areas so they can actually compete with the urban areas for these grants? Because if this is true, they're never going to have an equal footing in applying for these things or even understanding the risk and the vulnerability because we don't have the data.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you make some really good points. I've been digging deep into this community resilience zone proposal and their community resilience I can't remember what they call it now. Anyway, that equation, but they're actually taking these two approaches and kind of combining them into one equation. So they're saying that the social vulnerability index is divided by what they call the base brick. It's a resilience index that looks more at the community dynamics. I'm not actually convinced that it's not, they don't cancel each other out, but I haven't finished that analysis. But even more important, and it gets to your point, is the brick part, the social resilience part of it. It's only reported at the county level. And then they're taking the CDC vulnerability index at the tract level and combining the two, which means that the statistic is only good at the county level. So it's not really as precise as they are saying it is. And those are definitely the challenges that we have to think about.
Yeah, I think, do you also want to point out that in the other method, the social capacity method, that it's biased the other way.
In that
rural communities generally are more cohesive than urban communities.
Yeah, that's what the data is showing, that this group of folks, the Fraser paper that we shared, if you map it out, you find that the bonding relationships in rural areas are quite strong. whereas the linking relationships in urban areas are stronger. And so one way I'm thinking about using this information is it might help us learn how to better share information. So for example, in a community that has a very strong bonding propensity, we talk with school kids and families and small friend groups, affinity groups. Whereas if they have a really strong linking, we can go a more top-down sort of information dissemination. But that top-down approach won't work in a strongly bonded community because they're just they talk to themselves. So we might use these two different approaches simultaneously, but for different purposes. So that's something that we can think about as well.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, and also Deanna has her hand up. So
Yes.
I'm going to go to the chat first. Sorry, Deanna. Does either one of these approaches include a question from the happiness index about whether they have someone to turn to if they need help?
Yes, the first index,
this one,
the social capital index, does address that question. It somewhat indirectly because it's aggregated within the index itself. And that's actually another one of my issues about indexes, is that it's really hard to tease the pieces apart. But yes, that happiness index is another way of looking at how communities interact with each other. But yeah.
And then Althea commented that given the use of the deeply flawed NRI to prioritize funding, she's concerned that many communities will not get the resources they need.
Yes, I am concerned about that too. And I do have a small group of folks who have been participating on the Climate Change Adaptation Framework implementation team, who are working on some comments about the National Risk Index. Althea, if you'd like to join that group, I welcome you, and I can share our draft comments with you. But one of the issues I have is that the National Risk Index is too crude of a tool to be used out of the box to identify these community resilience, disaster resilience zones, and that they really only point you in it to an area, and then you have to do some on the ground work to figure out if that information is accurate or useful.
And Althea said, yes, please.
Yes, okay. I will add you to our list.
Okay, now finally, Deanna.
Hi, Deanna here. I'm Oregon's NFIP coordinator. Chris, you asked about if anybody else is using these social vulnerability indexes, and I've emailed a couple times to our hazards group about this, but in our community assistance program grant with FEMA, we do use something that's called the Community Engagement Prioritization Tool.
Okay.
So it's the EPT tool, and it's FEMA's applications, the ARC-based GIS tool that we use to help us prioritize engagements with communities, primarily CACs and CAVs, so a community assistance contact or a community assistance visit. Basically, those are audits that we do in our grant to reach out to communities to find out which communities are most at need for a visit or a contact in our grant, because it's such a large part of our grant. It creates a list of candidates from like highest need to lower need. And from what I understand, it does measure social vulnerability. I don't know what characteristics in this chart that you have up that it measures. It doesn't give us that metadata. It also measured such things as risk, opportunity, and interest in need.
Okay.
So it can answer questions like, is this a post-disaster community? What is the community's history of mitigating risk? Property. has the community demonstrated or expressed a need in managing their flood risk? And what's the professional capability and capacity of the local government? I don't really know how it measures these. It could be from the data that we enter into CIS.
Yeah.
And pull, and that CIS is, my understanding, it's depreciating because they're trying to phase that out.
Okay.
So, I guess we're to kind of use this as a recommended kind of secondary tool to identify who we visit for CACs and CAVs. And we're to use other things that we have at our disposal as well, like contact and requests and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
so
we need
also,
an AGOL account to access it. I've used it to help us identify some audits, but there again, I don't know how, if it depreciates or how, what's the word, effective it is.
right.
Unanswered questions.
Yeah, yeah.
The
I would be
beginning of the
interested
tool.
in learning more about what elements are in it and where they get their data. Because, you know, part of my challenge and our challenge in designing this risk assessment is to figure out where the data is and how we might use it to support our decision making. So
Okay.
Susan's hand is up.
Right, and then Jay.
And then Jay. Yeah.
Hi, great. Thanks, Chris. Susan Millhauser, Natural Hazards Planner focused on wildfire with DLCD. And I was just going to mention, and some folks may know this, but the Oregon State University is using the CDC Social Vulnerability Index as part of their legislatively mandated wildfire hazard mapping across the state. So it's a separate layer that is being used mostly at this point by the Oregon State Fire Marshal to help determine where to focus on grant making. So it's really, and then just to also echo what Jay was saying about the census tract data in rural areas, it not being as robust is certainly something that came up in the conversations of the rulemaking committee that led to the rules for the map work. So, but they're currently using that. So I just want to mention that.
Thanks.
And I'll just swing in here, and I think it was mentioned briefly earlier in the chat by Katie Skagel about equity. And as I think most of us know, and since the Biden administration came in from day one, they are now requiring all federal programs to account for how they address diversity, equity, and inclusion in their rollout. And and then when you get into the grant applications, they're now very much interested in how you account for disadvantaged communities that are impacted negatively or beneficially by the mitigation grants. And so the importance of this information is so critical. Yeah, I guess the other side of it is the confidence in what it is you're actually saying or representing, and the importance, I guess, more than anything, of something that was really preached at the Natural Hazard Center was as much direct engagement and representation you can have from these populations in the first place, not just simply speaking on their behalf, but actually working as best as you can to have them represent themselves and their concerns and interests.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but just tagging that for the sake of, this is why we're doing this in the first place, for the grant and the mitigation planning that has to address these things by federal requirements.
Yeah, so the index that's not mentioned on my slides is what Jay was talking about, the Justice 40. And that's an index that builds on the Social Vulnerability Index and has different or more elements to it. I haven't looked at the Justice 40 Index for a while, and I can't remember all the pieces that are in it, but it builds on the Social Vulnerability Index. And
Yeah.
yes, Katie did mention that that the FEMA is looking for feedback on the National Risk Index and its use for articulating communities that disaster resilient zones, and we are making comments on that as a state. And so any of you that are interested in participating in that, I know it's off topic here, but please let me know.
Mike Howard says that the Community Wildfire Defense Grant utilizes the CDC SVI 2019 version as a method to prioritize grants, and he dropped a link into the chat.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next slide.
So needless to say, this pillar of social vulnerability is going to be a critical element of our upgraded natural hazard risk assessment, and there isn't one way to do it. And I think we need to be careful about just pulling something off the shelf because everyone else is doing it. And I would like us to critically evaluate these tools and select one for a reason. And that's sort of why I'm sharing this information with you. And if you all know of indexes that people are using, as has been mentioned in the chat, please pass it along so that we have we're looking at a broad spectrum of ways of looking at social vulnerability. Okay. So all that being said, not everything that we can do in the Oregon Natural Hazard Risk Assessment can be quantitative. We are going to have to make some qualitative decisions. And I wanted to talk about some approaches that have been used in the past to make these kind of qualitative assessments. So I'm going to start with the sea level rise impact tool that we are piloting in Clatsop County. So this tool, if you had a chance to look at it, is a spreadsheet workbook that walks through identification of assets, and that term asset is used very broadly. It could be anything from a building to a park to a water main or anything. Looks at the assets within a sea level rise inundation area and assesses the vulnerability and importance of that asset to the functioning of the community. The tool, it was meant to be used in conversation with people in a public setting or in a broad work group. It's not meant to be filled out by one person sitting in their office. So the idea with the sea level rise impact assessment tool is to broaden out the kinds of assets that that make a community function socially and in their infrastructure, and that it gets the community in conversation about what is important to them. So that's the sea level rise impact assessment tool. It does not rely on census data. It relies on the ground conversation with the affected people or people in a community. And then there's a process that has been used by the state for a long time, the hazards assessment methodology. And I'm going to, at this time, turn it over to Joseph to talk about that tool.
Yeah, I don't know, 5 or 6 slides, but I'll try to get through them quickly. And I appreciate the opportunity. I think not only are we talking about this because it's been in essentially continuous use since 1983, believe it or not, but also because it's utilized in almost all of the local mitigation plans around the state. And the first thing I've got on a slide here is my disclaimer that last night when I was deciding I needed to put some slides together, I decided to recycle some old slides instead of creating new ones, but they're completely accurate. They're just not on our current agency template. So because local mitigation plans are typically updated on a 5-year cycle, their analyses using this methodology are also typically updated on a 5-year cycle. And our agency, State Emergency Management, used to require updates at least once every 5 years as tied to a grant program. We've been less strict about doing that in recent years, but we used to do that. And as I note here, what we've called for a long time the OEM hazard analysis methodology, it's really a hazard ranking system. And there are a lot of good reasons to rank hazards from a planning perspective. I think one of my slides goes into that, so I'll wait until we get there. But it produces scores from an absolute low of 24 to an absolute high of 240. And so there's one order of magnitude between the lowest possible score and the highest possible score. And if you could go to the next slide. Okay. Well, I can see that. It's a little hard to see, but probably most people can see that. These are the components that are used in the scoring system, and I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but the 4 big categories are history, vulnerability, maximum threat, and probability. And they're weighted differently. The category that has the lowest weighting is history. And the category has the highest weighting is maximum threat. I'll circle back to that in a second here. And I think probability is weighted about 3 times as high as history. So, we're more concerned with looking forward than we are with looking backwards. If we look backwards, it'll give us some sense of what's occurred in the community in the past and kind of what we need to take a look at. But communities change, and as we all know, the climate's causing changes to hazard probability. And so we're more concerned with looking forward than looking backwards. So in each of these overall categories, there's criteria for giving them a low, medium, or high score. And if you go off to the right side of this slide here, you can see that there's some points associated with low, medium, and high. Let's just go to the next slide, I think. This is included in the information for the meeting. So if anybody wants to look closer, you'll have it. And if you want to ask questions, I'm probably the person to ask. I love to tell people that when I came to work for the state in 1984, this was one of the first projects I was turned loose on. So I've been at this for ages. This is just an example matrix that shows you a little bit more about how the scoring system works. You see their probability has a weight factor of 7 versus history, which has a weight factor of 2. And then maximum threat has twice the weight as vulnerability. And the idea is that in vulnerability, you look at a kind of a typical occurrence of the hazard in the community. And then under maximum threat, you'll look at the worst case scenario, if everything went as badly wrong as it possibly could go, what would be impacted by that kind of an event. And you can see some scores here. Again, 24 is the lowest the method generates, and 240 is the highest. So for this example community, these are all kind of in the medium high range. And let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this is an example from a city mitigation plan. And on the west side of the Cascades, and a city mitigation plan that's currently under update, by the way. So this will probably change pretty soon here. But you can see how the city of Medford scored their hazards using this methodology. And the score, no surprise here, but the hazard that scored the highest was wildfire. The Cascadia earthquake's pretty high up there, but it's not as high as drought or a winter storm, but it's pretty high up there. And down near the bottom is, landslides at the very bottom there with a score of 89. And landslides, they're terrible things and occasionally kill people, and it can destroy developed property, houses, infrastructure. But typically they impact a pretty small area of a community. So they ultimately usually end up with fairly low scores. If you could go to the next slide. This is from a county as opposed to a city, and way over on the east side of the Cascades. This is really hard to see. This is a little fuzzy here. But oddly enough, wildfire here is also the highest ranked hazard with a score of 240. So it's a maximum score. And poor air quality, probably tied to wildfires, is their second ranked hazard. And down at the bottom, floods. You do get floods in Wallowa County and Enterprise, the city of Wallowa, a few rural areas, and they impact houses and people, but overall, they're not the highest threat to Wallowa County. So I have one more slide? There's a little more I want to talk about. There we go. So thank you for whoever's advancing my slides for me. So that ideally the way this works is that you assemble a team of local officials, and usually it's the same team of people that are working on a mitigation plan update. And pretty early in, if you're doing it as part of the mitigation plan update, you do it pretty early in the process. And the way it's supposed to work is they use real data. They pull the flood maps off the shelf. I'm using that term in a cliche sort of way. These days you'd open them on your screen in front of you, but you'd pull up the flood maps and you'd pull out your Dogami studies, and the studies have been done for the landslide hazard and for soft soils for earthquakes. And in other words, you'd use real data as a basis for doing the analysis. But if you're able to rank your hazards, you're also able to use that as one of the methods for prioritizing mitigation projects. If you got limited resources, why not throw those resources where the risk is greatest? And it's true for response planning too. You can't plan for everything all at once. And if you need resources to help you with your response, maybe it makes sense to direct your time and resources towards the higher ranked hazards. But the other thing I've discovered when you take a group through this process is that they'll learn things from one another as they talk about the hazards that end up being important to the planning process. I think that's my last slide, and I can't recall wanting to say any more about it, but I'd be happy to answer questions either verbally or in the chat, or follow-up questions by email address. I should have included my email address as part of the slide set, but I'm easy to find. Chris, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so yes, this is an approach to evaluating risk. Again, it relies mostly on ranking instead of a formal score. And the ranking in this case is only relevant to the area that the exercise is being done on. So a score of 240 in Wallowa County is not equal to a score of 240 in another area. Because you're not doing it statewide. So it does have the advantage of being being local. but it has a disadvantage of it's hard to compare among counties or among cities because it is so local.
Jay has a comment.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Joseph and Christine, for having us in this position to review and discuss this, because I guess that's my question as DLCD is now leading the mitigation plan update. And Joseph mentioned that this particular process or methodology has been in place now for, I guess, 40 years. And so it just makes me wonder, are we at a pivot point or a transition point in the way we do this at the state, between the differences in which state agency is now in the lead role, or just based on so many more types of analysis that are here now, despite the tradition of doing it this way. I've had some frustrations with the level of subjectivity that's involved through the process too. And I know Joseph is ready to.
I don't know if I need to raise my hand, but I raised my hand anyway. So I don't think I can answer the question definitively, but I suspect that if we come to the logical conclusion of this state risk assessment upgrade project, that it produces a new methodology for use around the state of Oregon that is, trying to find fancy words here, empirically defensible, that uses real data and some real keen analysis to come up with defensible results. My hunch is that will either quickly or gradually replace what we've been redoing over the past 40 years. And there'll probably be a transition to using it in local and tribal mitigation plans, but we haven't had that specific conversation, but that's my hunch about what's likely to occur.
Mm-hmm. And I can see that there may be elements of this approach that gets ported into a new risk assessment methodology. It's not like it's one or the other. For example, many risk assessments don't account for the worst case scenario versus the average case. Maybe that's something we want to retain. So, right.
Sorry,
Well,
I
I'll
was
just say
muted.
this.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, our mitigation advisory committee was taken to task about the 100-year interval.
That's
and how problematic that is for low frequency but high consequence events like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, and how I don't know, it kind of ties your hands to try and account for something like that.
Right. So maybe some tweaks are in order. I don't want to give the impression that we're just going to throw out the old method and substitute something new. There are benefits and maybe some things we can change, some elements we can add, or maybe some discipline about using it that we can add, some data, that kind of thing.
Gianna?
Yeah, I've worked with Jay on this for Clackamas County, and we did come across quite a bit of issues with the subjectivity of it, with the number ranking or assigning the geological versus the climate hazards. One thing that I was kind of a little concerned about, and I think that we could expand on, is the vulnerability ranking, is that it is just vulnerability as a single variable rather than, say, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, infrastructure. And I know that we're going to be working on that, but I think that adding some more variables to expand it, to give it a bit more nuance, would be really valuable, because it is right now 4 variables, which doesn't always, it's not taking into account the whole story. So I find it was an interesting process. I will say it was good in terms of understanding where we are as a county, but I think it can desperately be expanded upon.
There's a comment in the chat that I want to comment on from Matt, and I don't know, other people are reading it here. So theoretically, this methodology is designed to avoid just the problem Matt's pointing out. It's people always want to plan for the most recent hazard instead of taking an objective look at what could happen and how bad is it likely to be and how often is it likely to occur. And I agree with the comments that both Jay and Gianna made about the shortfalls of this methodology, but it's really intended to get around this, that you look, how many floods have we had in our jurisdiction in the past 100 years that have required our jurisdiction to activate its emergency operations center, to activate its emergency plan, and to respond in an extraordinary way. And those are typically the kinds of events that get counted.
Right. So, but what might be missing from the table that people are sitting around is the data. And that is one area where perhaps the state's risk assessment can provide that kind of data at people's fingertips so that they can use it in a quantitative way.
But if we continue to use this, I would very much like it to be more often based on good, solid data. But one of the best points that Jay and Gianna made was that for low frequency, high impact events like volcanoes and earthquakes, 100 years of records not the right time frame to use.
Right. Yeah, that's another tweak that we can possibly incorporate.
So there's a question in the chat about historical records and how far back do they go? And I think it depends on what you mean by historical records, but if we're talking about, kind of written information since the West was settled by generally people from Europe, back in the early 1800s, that's kind of when the written records begin, and we've got very little, older than that in the way of written records. There are stories in native cultures about events that occurred. The most classic of those is Mount Mazama. There are stories about the eruption of Mount Mazama, and which is now Crater Lake. And then there's a geologic record has been put in the chat, right? We know a lot from the geologic record, and there's a lot of stuff we're discovering through LIDAR that was lost to history until we had good LIDAR data.
Right.
Okay, I would like to do a time check. It's 2:45. We have until 3, and I'm hoping that we'll have some more discussion before we're finished to try to answer the questions that Chris is posing as we're going through this. So if there are no other burning questions, I'd like to move along.
Yep.
Okay.
I just have a couple more slides before we start talking. So on the subject of eliciting information on quantitative subjects, how do we, elicitation, the definition being the facilitation of quantitative expression of subjective judgment. And there are tools that have become available that help us quantify our subjective judgments. And I'm hoping that we can use some of those tools to either build the risk assessment or to provide guidance to locals on how they can use them when they are dealing with areas that don't have a lot of quantitative information. So some of the techniques that are used are panels of experts rather than a guy sitting in an office. And I know that Joseph's technique anticipates that groups of people are doing this. But there are also ways that those panels can be calibrated so that we understand the certainty that people bring to the table or not. And there are statistical ways to adjust your subjective judgments based on calibration. Yeah, so there are tools available to make these subjective judgments a little more comparable and help us understand the range of uncertainty associated with those judgments. So I'm hoping that we can build some of those tools into our subjective judgment parts of the risk assessment, and there will be places where we have to do that. We just don't have the data. And I think that's it for me.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'll get to this part in a little while.
Mm-hmm.
So between now and about a quarter till, I think.
Yep, about half an hour. Mm-hmm.
Do you have that list of questions, Chris? Because I cannot bring it up on my screen right now.
List of questions.
It's in the expanded agenda. No. Or maybe we can, perhaps I can stop sharing and Ashley can share at this point. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't bring that up, so it would take me a minute to find it.
All right.
Did you want me to share the slides or the questions?
The slides, please.
Okay.
I thought you wanted to share the questions in the annotated agenda.
Well, yeah, bring that up for myself here. Okay, so essentially we want to go back and revisit the things that Chris has been talking about and Joseph, and see if we can come to terms on some of these things today so that we can move toward our ability to actually begin building our risk assessment. So Ashley, if you can go back to the risk equation portion, way back in the beginning. Thank you.
Yep.
That's good. So the questions we have are whether to come to some agreement on the risk equation and the components that we want to build into the tool. We want to talk about coming to agreement on some of the definitions that were presented. We want to consider whether we want to calculate probability with or without, or with both, with or without climate change, do both, so that we can see what the difference is before and after climate change, and whether we agree to include uncertainty. And then we'll move back to the next set of topics, the social capital and individual characteristics, and we have some questions for that, and the same for the qualitative risk assessment methods. So if we can just start here about the risk equation, and if you have a level of comfort with it or not, or still some questions about it.
Matt has his hand up.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, I just whoa, let me back up here. Yeah, I guess maybe again, I dropped off the call for just a second, so maybe I missed some of the explanation, but I was curious about the equation where one of the factors is maximum risk, or sorry, max threat.
Mhm.
And then the probability factor. Is the probability associated with, so is it like, is the max threat the worst case scenario? And is the probability related to that worst case scenario event, or is it something different?
I'll try to quickly answer that. Probability of occurrence is really tied to an average occurrence or a normal occurrence, and not to the worst case scenario.
Okay. Yeah, and this, I guess this would tie back to what we're kind of struggling with. Well, one of the things we're struggling with, which is, you know, what scenario do we use to characterize what the risk is? If we're picking a singular scenario, and that's what, you know, in my risk assessments, that is something, I don't know, we made some decisions because you just have to, and then we move forward. But I'm not saying that the way that we do it is the way that it should be done, but it is definitely something to I mean, you know, try to answer early. But I have my own, like, you know, like, for example, with flood, we went with the 100-year flood because for several reasons. You know, it strikes that balance between probability of occurrence and the an extent of impact. Even though, you know, like a 10-year flood's going to happen more frequently, but the impact isn't as great. But then on the other hand, 500-year, maybe not as frequent. So that's sort of like, and I think so we picked the 100-year just because of the familiarity. People know what it is. It's more tangible, I guess. It's also, you know, the flood insurance is based on the 100-year, all that stuff. So I don't know. So I kind of use the 100-year as my sort of goalpost for trying to figure out what to do with the other hazards. I guess that's all my comments there.
Yeah, that's something that we have to think about. And then, of course, that probability or that it will change because of climate change. So maybe the thing that we used to think of as the 100-year flood is now the 50-year flood or the 75-year flood. So yeah, different scenarios.
Okay, so does anybody have any heartburn with these 4 elements of risk?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. I just want to clarify something. The response part of it is I would like to hear your thoughts about that. The risk associated with the response.
Chris, was that in response to something that was in the chat? Sorry, I think I lost the train of thought there.
No, I was just saying that green response bubble is something that is new. It hasn't been assessed before in our state risk assessments. And so I would just like to hear people's thoughts about that.
I'll jump in. I have to get off for another call at 2:30, but I'm interested in that. I mean, I guess like all of them, you know, how you characterize it and document it, and how applicable it is across all hazards would be interesting to me. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that I have been more interested in recently is assessing community vulnerability independent of any one hazard. And trying to just think along the lines of where the needs are, where the unmet needs are, where there has been marginalization, and to work on those areas as opposed to having to do it through a lens of any given hazard and hazard program and funding stream and policies, and all of those tend to never get to the real heart of the issue because of those limitations through a program area. And this response portion that talks about adaptation and capacity, I think is a nice index to open up and try and figure out how do we equally, universally try and capture that and apply it. And it would be interesting to see also, you talk about the disparities between how the OEM ranking changes from county to county, and how this mitigation and adaptive capacity may be leveraged by the linking that goes on between communities and jurisdictions and across boundaries for hazards too, for things like mutual aid and any number of things. So I guess I'd like to think there's a lot of depth there if we can figure that out.
If you have how to do it, yeah. Yeah, it may not happen in our initial assessment of risk, but then when we start thinking about mitigation approaches, we can add that in as an element.
Chris, there's a question in the chat about, there are several questions in the chat. Okay. Is the duration of events part of this? Is preparedness part of responses? The word makes it seem like actions post-event. And
okay, so I'll take the duration one. Yes, duration can be part of our risk characterization.
It actually needs to be.
It actually
for
needs to be.
FEMA's requirements. Is preparedness part of responses?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Or it could be part of vulnerability as well. That's one of the decisions we might have to make, is where we put things like preparedness.
So there's a conversation going on here. Ethan says, Jay Wilson's comment, there are indeed several broad-based indicators of vulnerability to non-specific human or natural hazards, such as SVI. I don't know what CRE is, Ethan.
Community resilience, something. Yeah, I know what that is.
Okay. Or even small area life expectancy by zip code or census tract has been proposed for this purpose. And Nancy says, I like the addition of the response section, opportunity for environmental mitigation. And Ken Schlegel says, the 100-year terminology was just developed for ease of explanation, but is actually measured as a 1% chance of happening within a year of the last time it has happened. 500 years, a 0.5% chance. It is not that it will only happen every 100 or 500 years, just for clarification.
Yep. We're supposed to get away from that 100-year flood or 100-year event terminology for that reason.
It's very confusing to people. Okay, so I haven't heard anything, anybody say anything or write anything in the chat that would lead me to think that we are not. Oh, wait, there's something more in the chat now. Preparedness seems to fall more into responses since it includes institutional, in parens, capture state investments and community and individual, for example, on the ground implementation of smart ag practices.
Right.
So I don't see anything here that would keep us from moving forward with all 4 bubbles. Oh, Sarah, you have something to say. I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
No, I just put it up. I just wanted to say that term responses, it might be the hiccup with the confusion, since that's a normal term used throughout emergency management. So I would just suggest renaming that section and adding preparedness in there, because that would be I don't see it explicitly called out, and I think it might be good to call it out.
Do you have a thought for what responses should be called instead, or could be called instead?
So initially, my first thought was calling it mitigation or something with mitigation practices or mitigation. I was trying to think of another action word to use instead of response or responses, but yeah, I'm open if anyone has any suggestions.
That's a really good point. That's kind of a loaded term in the emergency management field. So on the risk equation, I have another question for folks about ecosystems. I think that it would be wonderful to be able to assess the vulnerability of ecosystems or exposure and vulnerability of ecosystems, but I'm not sure we have the know-how to do that.
Well,
any thoughts there? You had a comment, Marion?
Yeah, I did. Mike Howard says 1% annual chance floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, and the 0.2% annual chance of the floodplain. So he's correcting 0.5% to 0.2%.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say that I think that there was interest among IHMT members, the Interagency Hazard Mitigation Team members, which is 20 some odd state agencies, universities, that we do want to be able to address it. We haven't addressed it very well to date, but there is definite interest in doing that. And one of the surveys that we have planned is to the folks who have that expertise. So we may find out down the road that we can't do it this time, but I think we should try.
Okay, so what are some of your other questions on the list, Marion?
Oh,
spur conversation.
Okay, do we agree on the definitions of hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and responses? Do we want to calculate probability both with and without climate change? And do we want to include uncertainty? So are these the definitions here, or did you have different definitions on another slide? I can't remember.
No, these pretty much capture the definitions.
Okay.
So essentially what I was trying to capture here is that the hazards exist independently of what's exposed. What's exposed, it exists independently. I mean, they're linked, but they're evaluated independently from vulnerability. So in some risk assessments, vulnerability and exposure are kind of mixed together. And I'm trying to separate them out primarily because I'm thinking about presenting the risk assessment on a GIS, and setting it up like this would make that easier.
Marianne is asking, oh wait. Marianne is asking, could you explain why we'd want to calculate without climate change? Would that be some kind of baseline? Would it confuse people into thinking no climate change is a possibility? And then Curtis is asking, do we have the tools necessary to calculate risk based on climate change? If yes, he recommends that we should.
Okay.
And
I don't know
Sarah,
the answers to Curtis's question. I don't know if we have the tools, maybe not for all hazards, but.
Yeah, it would only be for those that are influenced by climate change, but Judith says climate change is the uncertainty.
Yes.
So can you explain why we'd want to calculate it without climate change? It's baseline or?
Yeah, I think we were talking about calculating risk with and without climate change, not one or the other, so that we can show a long-term trend in or increase in hazard. Assuming it's increased, could be decreased, but I doubt it. But
okay, Sarah.
So my comment is not related to climate change. So if there's anyone else that wants to talk about that, I'll defer to them. Okay, not hearing anything. So just thinking about just that definition for number 4 for responses. I mean, I was trying to think of a one word term, maybe just actions. Could fill that void there and not use the word responses.
Yep.
And then editing that definition a tiny bit, or I keep looking at the definition there on the side, but not looking at the words in the bubble. But maybe adding preparedness into that bubble. That was it.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, going back to questions. So it sounds like we're okay on the components and the definitions with these tweaks. And so now we're talking about whether we're doing probability with and without climate change. And then we'll talk about uncertainty. And we have about 15 minutes left today to get through a lot of material. Do we have anybody here today for public comment? I don't think we do. Okay, so that gives us back a few minutes. Okay, more on the climate change discussion? Without, or both?
Well, I think we have to address it per FEMA guidance somehow.
Right, right. That's true. Okay, Matt Williams and Christopher.
Yeah, I mean, I was literally about to say that, Chris, is that we have to address it. Even if it wasn't a FEMA guidance thing, I still think it's like we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
But I don't know, from what I've read so far, it just seems like making things, to give it a really defined probability. I don't know if there's anything there to really do that. I mean, it seems like it's just like it's going to increase or decrease. It's going to increase the probability of something happening. It just didn't say how much. I mean, there is a little bit with wildfire. It seems like there is some statistical data that maybe, I don't know, I'm not a stats guy, but I'm just saying, like, it was like, what I was reading was like, there's going to be 25 more days of, low vapor or something, which is an increase from, 30 days, let's say.
Yeah.
So that's something there, but with like flood, with landslide, it was like, it's going to increase. There's going to be atmospheric rivers more frequently. And so the likelihood of landslides increasing, or the likelihood of landslides will increase. So
right.
I don't know. I just want to throw that in there. I have to actually go to, I got to pick up my daughter.
Okay.
But it's a good conversation. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. And Christopher, do you want to be called Christopher or Chris?
Chris is good.
Okay, thanks.
Just to build a little bit on the last comments, I don't see how you can leave climate change out. And it's really, when you think about it, yes, there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty for a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is we don't know how much we might come together and actually start doing effective things to reduce the maximum worst scenarios. So that builds on just predicting what the outcomes would be from a given amount of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. But it's true of all the hazards. It's true of how well can you predict an earthquake? You're just basing that on past history and something about the geology of the area, and making some judgments there. And the same with floods, or maybe to a lesser extent with volcanic eruptions and those kinds of things. But there's impossible uncertainties around all these things that we're trying to deal with. And so climate change is just thrown into the mix like anything else. You can't make a justification. Well, we don't know it well enough to be able to quantify it well enough to make it useful. You got to work with what you got. And actually, there's a whole lot of pretty good predictions, at least they've been made, on the number of increasing days of heat and how that might impact populations, and how much more rain you might squeeze out of the atmosphere when you put more moisture up there, and all those kind of things. So I think there's a lot that you can roll in from climate change into the other hazards.
Yeah, we might not be able to quantify that uncertainty, but we can qualitatively make mention climate change will increase this by 2 check marks or 1 check mark based on our state of knowledge. Yeah.
So there are a number of messages in the chat. Sarah says she likes the idea to see both with and without, so you can compare and contrast. Marianne asks, will this include intervention impacts? If you invest in X, you will reduce risk of Y.
Yeah, that's what the green bubble is supposed to get at. Yeah.
And Emma says about finding another word for responses. What about approaches?
Okay.
And Marianne then says, or interventions, actions as mentioned earlier. Yeah.
Interventions. I like interventions.
Is everybody clear on what this means? I'm not sure that we're really clear on what the responses thing is. Maybe I'm not understanding it well enough either. But I think it's what mitigating what impacts you would, or negative adverse impacts you would have just in your response to an incident.
It's not so much response to an incident so much as the approach you take to mitigate or adapt, and what risk does that introduce to the system.
Okay. Steve said, Mike Howard says he prefers interventions too. Steve says it's important that we don't base everything on quantitative information alone. We're all going to need to give input into the process based on our collective hundreds of years of experience and our respective practices.
Yep.
And Zach says, to Sarah's point on changing the verbiage to actions, he would also want to add the aspect of actors, individuals or groups who make decisions surrounding those areas of mitigation and adaptation, pathways, institutional, etc. But that's another layer of complexity. But addressing the who in all of this would be very valuable. And Susan says about climate change, how could we leverage or integrate future climate projections work that OCRI does for Oregon communities that we use in local NHMP updates? I see that Erica isn't here today. You're correct. Erica isn't here today, and she will be intimately involved in figuring out how we integrate climate change into the vulnerability equation. And Steve says he recommends we change from climate change to climate adaptation. And Judith has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I thought it would be easier than typing a bunch in the chat, just to say, as much as I actually do like interventions, I think that could be interpreted as oh no, they're starting to be prescriptive. Somebody's going to start showing up on my door for an intervention. That's the only reason I wouldn't like it. I do like actions and actors with the actors, because there's that whole community, there's a whole plethora of actors, right, that we're relying on all rowing in the same direction. So I like actions and actors, even though, I like the creative word of intervention, but just a word of caution there. That's all. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so back to our question about probability with or without climate change.
Both.
What I'm hearing, and people can chime in and tell me if I'm wrong, is that we address it, but we may not be able to do it quantitatively. for all hazards, even ones that are climate impacted.
Okay, and it may just come down at some point in the future as we're doing this to what our capacity is to do
Yep.
both.
Mhm.
But maybe we just put that the baseline as something we would like to do if we can. And the last question for this section is whether we agree to include uncertainty one way or another. How it's going to be done is not the question, just whether to do it. I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Oh, that's better. Thank you.
Hi, yeah, this is Emma from OHA. The question about uncertainty, in my mind, that's kind of linked to including climate change, because those kind of are very much the same in certain instances, but then at the same time they're not. So I just feel like how would we include one without the other? I don't know.
Mhm.
Curtis, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up. I was writing notes.
No, you're okay. I just raised it. I guess my opinion on uncertainty is yes, I think we should include it just because it's important for transparency's sakes and allows us to be transparent about here are the things that we are certain and or uncertain about, recognizing that this document is going to be a living document that we will continue to refine as it's being updated.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we move on? Okay, so let's go to the social capital slide. There we go. Would using social capital add value to the risk assessment? Do we want to use it? Don't everybody speak at once.
I do think, hello, this is Judith. I do think we should use it. Because again, it talks about, I mean, it's going to be very important. For example, you know, government, what appropriations are being made at all different kinds of levels, and what those investments are going to very much determine how we can help local capacity, how we could help with demonstration projects on the ground to help people implement. I mean, it just helps elevate all of that. And Chris, to your point before, I think you're absolutely right. We have to go with a qualitative assessment if that's all that we realistically can do. You know, that's what we have to try and capture, try and explain what we're trying to get across is, you know, the best way forward.
Steve and Zach, in the chat, you both put yes, but I don't know what your yes is referring to.
Oh, I was saying yes to yes, we should include social capital in some way or another. You know, conceptually, I can see the benefit in doing the work of kind to try I guess like try to implement these concepts of bonding, bridging, and linking. I can see them playing out in like a GIS or like some data-driven tool, like really in a way that I think like can visually lay out these things in a way we could better understand them. I think it would be really beneficial to have it.
Okay, and Marianne asked in the chat whether the indicators are redundant with others we're using.
Sometimes that's one of the things that how can I say this? Yeah, they are a little bit redundant, but not by very much, but that's something that we would have to assess.
Okay, Matt Jensen?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for including me in this conversation. My comment is when you're dealing with the US Census, a lot of times it doesn't fit very well with tribal reservation boundaries.
Yep.
And so looking at it from that lens, just want to make sure that that's aware that it's a known and we can move forward. But I think social capital should be included.
Okay, great.
Okay. All right, so then we can move on to the next set of questions and hopefully finish before the end of our day together. Okay, this is about the qualitative risk assessment methods. And we have 5 questions in this one. And whoops, where'd it go? Okay, I'll just read you all the questions and we'll try to handle them. Are there other qualitative risk assessment techniques we should consider? Could the method that Joseph described be refined and used? I think we already discussed that it could. Which qualitative risk assessment method would we want to use? Or should we use more than one depending on which element or data set we're applying it to? And what are the effective ways to elicit qualitative probabilities from subject matter experts? So does anybody want to suggest another qualitative risk assessment technique?
Or I'd like to know if any of you have used methods of calibration and some of these techniques for quantifying the range of the sort of range of opinions that come out of a qualitative assessment. Christopher has his hand up. Chris does.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if you're thinking in terms of going more with non-parametric statistics rather than trying to come up with, the idea of a 1% chance in a year for a flood or something. You have categories and you rank the possibilities rather than calculating a specific number. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it's an idea.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I guess I just have a clarification question of like, do we envision, when we're ranking risk or assessing risk, it kind of just spits out one big number that calculates everything that we're kind of discussing, or like, does it come out as 3, like credit score numbers, like sort of thing? Like, what is the output of it?
Well, that's a question that that we're sort of in charge of, but I'll tell you, my personal opinion is that we want to keep things as disaggregated as possible. Gotcha. Because when you start aggregating things into a big score or even 3 scores, it makes it really hard to design interventions because you don't know what's driving the risk in a particular area.
And Judith says, have a review by university experts if we have time.
Right.
Okay. Good suggestions, all. Okay,
university experts come with their own biases, though, sometimes.
Well, yeah, but
you're right about that, Chris.
That's true, but this is a qualitative risk assessment.
Right.
Marianne, helpful for measuring equity. She put a link in the chat from nature.com.
Oh, great. Thank you.
An article. Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we already said that we could use pieces of or refine the method that Joseph has been using for many years. So next, which is your favorite among the ones that we talked about today? The sea level rise type of qualitative method, Joseph's type of qualitative method, or the eliciting information from subject matter experts?
Or all of the above.
Or should we use more than one depending on what it is we're evaluating? Everybody's tired.
All right, so I'll say something about the sea level rise spreadsheets. They are meant to be used within a group of people. And I think for a statewide risk assessment, that would be very difficult. However, that doesn't mean we can't use elements of that kind of assessment, like using mining local plans, for example, for critical facilities or something like that. So I guess I'm kind of bristling a little bit about that. What's your favorite? They all have their.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of goes to using whatever is most effective for that data set, or pulling from all of them. Deanna has something to say.
Marion, can you go back a slide?
Ashley, can you go back a slide? Thank you.
Oh, shoot. No, the
Which
one
slide are
you
you
had-
looking for?
Well, I'll just try to articulate what I was going to say. I think a method of subject matter experts might be best. So, for example, for floodplain, that's kind of, my field of expertise. And I might be able to, so it's the slide that you had on before this social capital one.
The panels, I think that's after this, after.
Yeah, if you go down like 2 slides,
Just
Ashley.
jog my memory about what I want to actually say. No,
Oh,
no.
yeah, maybe more. Keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 more. Oh, no,
It's
after Joseph.
after all Joseph's stuff, yeah.
There we go.
No.
That's not it?
it either.
Okay.
It was the discussion slide before this topic.
Okay, but what was it about? What?
I think I needed up to jog my memory about what I was gonna say. Shoot.
Oh, okay.
It was about offering direction or advice about a particular subject matter and like response to that. Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I'm
Well, okay, maybe this one?
No.
No.
If it comes to me later, I'm gonna have to let you know.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry.
And then anybody have any suggestions about effective ways to elicit qualitative probabilities from subject matter experts? And I'll note that it's 1 minute to 3. And Chris, maybe we'll just leave this question for now and skip to the homework slides.
Yes, I think that's a excellent idea.
Okay, next. Okay, there are 2 of these. Go ahead.
Okay, so over the course of the last 6 or 8 months, I have been combing the internet and other natural hazard mitigation risk assessments to come to identify different approaches and different interfaces, different what I call containers for risk assessment. So there are a bunch of them out there, and I've pulled some that I would like you to comment upon. And we did provide a list of questions to use as you go through the different tools. So we're hoping that you can critically look at each of these approaches and help us understand what you like about them, what you don't like about them, what you find useful, what's annoying, so that we can start to scope our own interface.
Okay, and if you'll skip to the next slide, we added one called InCore. We had a meeting with Katie Skagel, who was on the call earlier. I don't know if she's still here. And she's been working on this with a coalition of governments and universities. And I don't remember how many entities, something like 17 entities involved. And it's a very interesting methodology also. So we've added that one for you to look at. These are all in Box. Well, you have all the links to these in various places. And you can link to them from the slides. You can link to them from the materials on the website. They're in Box. There should be links in Box. And the questions to ponder are also in Box. And Erica and her team went through them and provided a spreadsheet. And it's great spreadsheet. So if you wanted to go into that spreadsheet and add a tab using Excel Online, add a tab and copy it, and then just put your own, copy it, take their answers out and put your own answers in, that would be really helpful. Okay, so now it's 3:02. I'm going to be respectful of your time. Our next meeting is August 16th. And thank you all for coming in the middle of the hot summer and spending your time with us this afternoon. We really appreciate all your input and good discussion. And there are a couple of comments in the chat. We'll be saving the chat and we'll be able to get back to you.
Yes, thank you for your thoughts. Very helpful.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you guys for all of your hard work. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.